I did my paper on the logging industry in Wisconsin. The logging industry began about 200 years ago. It started in the central regions of the state. Some of the first cities that were formed were Wausau, Eau Claire, and Stevens Point. And they were formed in the locations that they're at because of their location on the rivers. It was near forest areas, and then the loggers used the streams and the rivers to move logs down. It was easy transportation and relied just on nature to move the timber. Other cities like La Crosse were formed not because they were good in a good location for forests and logging, but because it was right on the Mississippi River, and that provided the ability to move the timber further to cities like St. Louis, where they just didn't have the industry. Um, because of the ability that we had to transport the lumber so easily, it actually was substantial for our economic growth in Wisconsin and actually has continued to be uh, a source of economic growth for the entire state. Um, a lot of the trees that were harvested at the time were pine trees, and they were in northern Wisconsin. The pine trees were so large that it only took 3 trees to build the average size house for the time period. I did not find like square footage amounts for that to get a more realistic idea of what an average size house for the time period entailed. Um, sorry. All right. The logging industry was such a phenomenal economic industry for us that it ended up using, after a while, sleds and large animals such as horse or oxen to help move across the land when they started getting further from the rivers, the more that they harvested. By the last quarter of the 19th century, we cultivated such a large number of trees that we had to again delve deeper into the surrounding forest in order to create a supply of timber equal to the demand. Um, at that same time, the last quarter of the 19th century, about 25% of the workforce in Wisconsin was employed in the logging and lumber industry. Um, our lumber was provided to over 1,000 mills in the area. We did not practice any type of sustainability or conservation efforts in that beginning. Um, Initially, the type of tree that was harvested was the white pine. It grew very straight, very tall, and was very buoyant in the water, so it was able to be transported down the river a lot easier. Um, Currently, because we didn't do any type of conservation in the very beginning, um, about those original trees that were harvested in the 1700s, only about 80% of that forest population, or initially it was 80% in the population. Currently, old growth or trees that are over 300 years old and they can actually be up to about 200 feet in length, we're down to about 1% of our total forest population in old growth. We've got the second growth, which are typically not more than 100 years old and therefore just not as large. So it now takes more trees to get the same amount of lumber as it did previously because we had not started the conservation efforts earlier. After the trees had been cleared from the area, again, we were not replanting, so the land was done for as far as the loggers were concerned. Um, then they decided to clear out the stumps and make way for farming in the area. They decided that that would be a good use of the land. A lot of the mill towns, when the trees were no longer available to be harvested, either became ghost towns or um, transform their mills to be able to produce paper for the area. Um, but when they needed to clear the land with the stumps being there, they typically would set fires. It just proved to be the fastest, most efficient way to clear the land rather than having to cut down into the tree, uh, into the ground, figure out how far the roots go. These are extremely old trees, so their roots would be very deep and very large. Um, and so, time wise, it was just more efficient from their point of view to just burn the logs down. But what that did is resulted in the Peshtigo fire, um, which ironically happened the same day as the Mrs. O'Leary fire in Chicago. But we just don't seem to know about it as much. Um, and in this instance, there had actually been fires preceding the big fire. Um, they had been putting out the fires with water as best they could. They had actually had extra water on hand because they feared that something like this may happen. But the night of the Peshtigo fire, there just wasn't enough. Lumber was used in everything. So the town of Peshtigo, everything was made of wood. The houses, the broom handles, the door handles. They even lined the streets with sawdust to soak up the mud to make them the roads less messy when they traveled on them and transported lumber across them. So when the fire caught, the entire city just went up in flames. It was so bad, they still do not have an official body count for how many people died in this fire. Somewhere between 1,250 and 2,500 people. There were only 1,700 residents in the town of Peshtigo at the time of the fire. The fire was so large that it actually jumped to other areas. There were 350 people buried in one mass grave because there just wasn't anybody left to identify their bodies. Everyone was dead. So 350 people were buried in one grave because there's no other option. What they suspect happened was a firestorm. A firestorm is essentially a tornado of fire, and the cool air comes in from the bottom and it just keeps feeding it up. The fire clouds their updrafts with the heat that they cause will rise up and can form they can form clouds that have more dense capabilities of producing lightning. And then when the storm clouds form, the lightning produces, it now creates more fires in other areas. So it can essentially just spread itself. The firestorm that affected the Peshtigo fire actually destroyed over 1,800 square miles of forest. Um, People were attempting to escape from the fire by jumping into the water, but the water was still cold. It was October in northern Wisconsin. The water was not pleasant temperature, and people died of hypothermia as well. Uh, Now, logging is still the second largest industry in Wisconsin. I was very surprised to learn that because it's just not something I've heard of common in the news and anything like that. Um, in 2013, we produced 2.1 million cords of pulpwood. Uh, and that's actually a 4% decrease from what we were producing in 2007. And we're still our number two industry. Um, we we have had to shift some of the trees that we are producing. The northern white cedar trees, it had an increase between 2007 and 2013 of 302% in their harvesting. On the flip side, though, the black walnut trees went to zero production in 2013. We stopped harvesting them. Um, in 2012, the state of Wisconsin had 59,000 workers employed in the logging industry. Up to 2016, that industry jumped to 64,000 jobs. We have produced over $24 billion in output annually, despite the logging industry only owning 7% of this forest in the entire state. We do now do conservation efforts. There are several government programs, the FIA, which is the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, and then the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which the USDA, we've all heard of that. Um, they each do different things. The Forest Inventory Analysis Program focuses on habitats for animals and the plant species in the forest. They try and balance, the ability for the logging industry to get to what they need to maintain without destroying the habitats of the surrounding area, so not to affect the native species in the area. And the USDA focuses most of its resources to maintaining privately owned forests. So it's if you own a house and you have a large amount of forest, the USDA helps you maintain the forest for the greater good of the entire state. Currently, there's the Great North Conservation Easement happening. Um, I found news articles on it as recently as April of this year. What they're going to do, or what they would like to do, is purchase about over 14,000 acres of forest in Iron County. They're going to put an easement in, and they're going to allocate money to building roadways and waterways and more trout streams. Their plan is that this will give more access to the land that was previously only accessible by very long hikes. And so they're hoping that this brings more tourism to the area as well. Uh, Another good thing that this will do is with the easement, it essentially ties all the property together, all the private property owners. Their land, it's now somewhat connected so that it can't be broken off into separate parcels and sold. That so that no one can over harvest the land. It's privately owned, but it's kind of not fully yours to do with what you would like to. Somewhat like a condo and having association fees and the like. Um, so it does seem that where I was surprised was that the logging industry is so prevalent in Wisconsin and that we are doing such drastic conservation efforts to um, maintain our forests and to replant and to not over harvest it. We at this time only harvest about 1% of the trees that are growing, um, and we leave the rest to keep growing and getting larger. So while there was some initial bad with the Peshtigo fire with the logging industry, I think overall the logging industry is managed fairly well in the state of Wisconsin, and we're going to be able to maintain it and grow it for years to come.